Illinois faces some big challenges. Today, we're about to hear a truly honest analysis of the problems we face. Equally as important, you'll also hear an in-depth discussion of some practical solutions. This is your radio source for stories, the insight, and the answers you won't hear anywhere else. Not in the media and not coming from Springfield. You're listening to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Now, here's your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Welcome to another installment of Illinois Rising. I'm Dan Proft, Morning Drive co-host of Chicago's Morning Answer with Amy Jacobson on AM 560, 5 to 9 a.m. Monday to Friday. And joining me on this edition is Pat Hughes. He is the co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project. And Pat, big news this week, but not unexpected news. That is the state of Illinois' credit rating downgraded yet again to just a notch above junk. That will probably happen, the downgrading to junk status, before the next month is out.
What's after junk, Dan? What comes after that?
That's the bottom of the barrel. But even the downgrade to Illinois' current credit rating is the worst credit rating of any state in the nation in the history of America.
In the history. Think about that. That's like over 100 years, right?
It's quite an accomplishment. Quite an accomplishment for the state of Illinois. But it's not unexpected because, of course, the rating agencies have been signaling these downgrades when they've made the downgrades. The lack of a budget, $14 billion of unpaid bills and climbing, $130 billion in unfunded public sector pension liabilities and climbing, and all of the other systems that are disintegrating before our very eyes, over which the state government lords. It's not a surprise that this would occur. The question is, number one, what should be done about it? And then number two, given divided government, Chicago Democrat control of the General Assembly and Republican reform Governor Bruce Rauner, what can be done about it as the budget impasse persists? For a little bit of help and perspective on this, particularly on the public sector pension matter, we're pleased to be joined by Jeffrey Dorfman, who is an economics professor at the University of Georgia, the Bulldogs, and a fellow at the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, who had a very compelling piece in Forbes this week on Illinois' credit rating. Professor Dorfman, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Sure. Happy to be with you.
So you wrote about Illinois. You get the broad strokes of our economic disintegration, and you really zeroed in on public sector pensions, particularly the form ours take here, the defined benefit plans. And what is your prescription for starting to deal with it, in Illinois' case, $130 billion in unfunded liabilities?
Yeah, thanks. I think the only way to both protect workers' retirement funds and the taxpayer from future enormous tax increases is for Illinois and other states and local governments to switch to defined contribution retirement plans, 401k style, where money goes in every month into an account with your name on it. State or local government can't steal it from you, and there can't be unpaid bills piling up for taxpayers to have to deal with at some future date.
Professor, in Illinois, we have a constitution that has an actual pension clause in it, and our Supreme Court has interpreted that clause to mean that if you are in the pension system, that your benefits cannot be changed, right? So for new people that come into the system, perhaps you can change to a defined contribution plan, but for people who are in the system,
they can't be diminished. We can always increase them.
Right. We can increase them, but we can't diminish them. Yeah. So given that, so we've got all sorts of pension debt that's sort of baked into the cake because of a feckless Supreme Court interpreting this clause incorrectly, but it is what it is. Given sort of that dynamic, how do you convince workers who the Supreme Court says are entitled to these benefits? How do you convince them to say you need to voluntarily go along with this, because if you don't, there's not going to be anything for you 20, 30 years down the road?
Yeah, probably you can't. I mean, I think it's a valid argument to say, I understand you want to keep everything you have, but if you try for that, you might end up with nothing because the money won't be there. But the easiest way to address the constitutional protection that Illinois and 6 other states have, and even states without constitutional protection tend to have very tough laws that get to about the same place of making it very hard to cut public pension benefits once awarded to employees, is you pass another constitutional amendment that removes that protection.
Right. Well, yes, and the political landscape in Illinois doesn't afford that. It seems to me, at least, as somebody who's been in this arena, in this state for the last 2 decades plus, that even though there's an increasing number of public sector employees, rank and file employees, who understand this cannot go on in perpetuity, there still is, as you perfectly understand, people being self-interested beings. As long as I get mine, as long as I get in under the wire, somebody else's problem, I held up my end, and they're just unwilling to confront a reality of pensions that are death spiraling, not 20 years out, but 5 to 7 to 10 years out, unwilling to confront that reality until it actually occurs.
Yeah, I think one of the ways you can get workers to sort of face that reality is when you point out that this isn't a question of, can I keep my pension and somebody other than me has to pay a little more taxes? This is really going to come down, and in Illinois potentially very soon, to do workers get to keep their pensions, or do we have money to pay for kids to go to school? I mean, in most states, K through 12 education represents roughly half of the state budget. So if you're going to find this money from somewhere, that's where a lot of it's going to come from. Now all of a sudden you get some citizen support, and workers don't really want to argue that their very generous pension benefits are more important than having teachers in the classrooms with your kids, for example.
Yeah, well, in Illinois, the idea of opportunity cost is a thought crime. So I'm not so sure that we're going to convince the Pauls in charge now, but that means we need to switch out some Pauls. I wanted to ask another question for you as somebody who observes this from a national perspective, state by state and doing the compares. What about the prospect? Of course, this has been bandied about not just Illinois, but Connecticut and elsewhere. The idea that, look, I understand what the clause says in our state constitution and some other states as well. But all we need is one federal bankruptcy court judge to say, yes, the state cannot go bankrupt, but the pension funds technically are not the state. So if they capsize and are unable to pay current beneficiaries, then they do, and you have to figure that out within the narrow confines of that fund and those beneficiaries and the benefits to which they have a legal claim.
I mean, in today's judicial system, anything can happen at any time. It hasn't happened yet. We have cities in California that have gone bankrupt and have still been required to continue full pension payments. So I haven't seen a case that looks like it's going to break that wall anytime soon.
Professor, is there for those of us who want to advocate for this type of reform, realizing that the ship is going under, is there a place in the country that we can point to say, look, this was a similar circumstance. Here is the reforms that they did. They were able to get public sector workers to kind of come on board. Is there a state where there's a model for advocates to go out and say, if we just do it this way or a version of this, this is sellable to the public and to the people in the unions?
That's a great question. I probably should have an answer to that. I'm blanking off the top of my head. I want to say I remember Pennsylvania maybe doing some reforms, but it's not coming to me at the moment. Yeah,
that sort of speaks to how difficult a hill it is to climb, right? To persuade people to kind of, really it's to persuade people that we're actually the people proposing reforms like you suggested, the 401k style plans. We're actually on your side. And the reforms that have been proposed here, even though they've been purposely mischaracterized by the bosses of the public sector unions, have always been prospective, right? We're only talking about benefits not yet earned for work not
Correct.
Yet performed. And yet, of course, the binary argument that the public sector unions want to fit that into is they're going after your pensions. Well, we're not.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, I don't agree with companies in the private sector that have gone bankrupt just to send their pension obligations and then pop right back out and go on as if nothing happened. I don't think we should steal money from workers
right.
When the money's available. So I'm with what you just said. I don't think we should tell workers we're going to break a promise about years you've already worked. But it certainly seems reasonable, and this you might be able to find a court to say, although we haven't yet, to say we can diminish retirement benefits for years you have not worked yet. That when you were hired, that promise didn't extend for every year you ever worked. You get new contracts each year. That we have the legal principle that one Congress, for example, and one state legislature cannot bind the hands of future ones. In fact, there have been court rulings that Social Security can change its rules anytime it wants. So courts have said that for Social Security, which is essentially a pension, the federal government can break its promise, can keep your money, can change it for the years you already paid in, not just future years. They can completely break every promise they ever made.
Oh, that's an
interesting. Legal.
Yeah, that's an interesting potential precedent. Maybe something that's we'll explore here as the basis for a legal argument. He is Jeffrey Dorfman, economics professor at the University of Georgia, also a fellow at the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. His piece on public sector pensions and Illinois' credit downgrade can be found in this week's postings at Forbes.com. Professor Dorfman, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Sure. Glad to be with you.
Thank you.